We live in a world that is quite literally built on promises, from a simple handshake to a massive business deal. But what happens when a promise is broken? How do we make sure that our word actually means something? Well, that's where the law steps in, with some powerful tools to turn a simple promise into an ironclad shield. Let's dive in. All right, here's our game plan. First, we'll talk about the basic power of a promise. Then, we're going to break down three key legal contracts. Indemnity, which is kind of like a safety net. Guaranteed, which you can think of as a backup plan. And agency, which is all about acting for someone else. And finally, we'll look at the rights and duties that come along with all of this.
Okay, so let's start at the beginning with the power of a promise. Now, it's easy to think of contracts as these stuffy, complicated documents just for giant corporations, but they're not. They are the absolute bedrock of trust in almost everything we do, giving us the confidence to do business or even just lend a friend some money. So let me ask you this. Have you ever been in that situation? Maybe you co-signed a loan for a family member, or you went into a business deal just kind of crossing your fingers and hoping for the best. You know that little voice in the back of your head that asks, but what if? What if they don't pay? What if I'm the one left holding the bag?
Well, the good news is you're not the first person to worry about that. The law has actually come up with some really clever special contracts designed specifically to manage that risk and to protect you when you're counting on someone else's word. And today, we're going to deconstruct three of the most important ones.
First up, let's talk about the contract of indemnity. The best way to think about this is like a safety net. It's a direct promise from one person to another that basically says, hey, if you suffer a loss because of something I do, or even something another person does, don't worry, I've got your back. I'll make it right.
And here's the official language for it, right from Section 124 of the Indian Contract Act. The phrase to really focus on here is save the other from loss. That's the entire purpose. And indemnity isn't about punishing anyone, it's about restoration. It's about putting the person who suffered the loss back in the exact same financial spot they were in before anything went wrong.
The beautiful thing about an indemnity contract is its simplicity. They're just two parties. You have the indemnifier, that's the person making the promise to cover the loss, and then you have the indemnity holder, the person who's getting the protection. It's a direct one-to-one relationship. And this isn't some new idea. It has really deep roots in English law, and a classic case called Adamson versus Jarvis shows it perfectly. So there was this auctioneer, Adamson, and a guy named Jarvis tells him to sell some cattle. Adamson does his job, but it turns out the cattle didn't belong to Jarvis. The real owner sues the auctioneer, and the court stepped in and said, nope, Jarvis, you told him to do this, so you have to cover his losses. It's a perfect illustration of the principle. Okay, now that we have that down, let's add another layer. If indemnity is a safety net, then a contract of guarantee is your financial backup plan. And this is a setup that probably sounds pretty familiar, especially when it comes to things like bank loans. So, Section 126 defines a guarantee as a promise to step in if a third person fails to do what they're supposed to. And that's the crucial difference. The liability here is conditional. It's a secondary promise that only gets activated if somebody else defaults on their primary promise. And this is exactly why a guarantee always involves three parties. It's a triangle. First, you have the principal debtor, the one who has the main responsibility to pay. Then there's the creditor, the person who's owed the money. And finally, you have the surety, or the guarantor, who is the backup plan. This three-party structure is the absolute defining feature of a guarantee. So let's put it side by side to make it crystal clear. Indemnity, two parties, and the liability is primary and direct. The person who promised has to cover the loss, period. Guarantee, three parties, and the liability is secondary and conditional. It only kicks in if the main debtor drops the ball. That's the big difference right there. Okay, our third and final structure is agency. And honestly, this concept is the lifeblood of commerce. I mean it. From the person managing your local coffee shop to the CEO of a global tech company, pretty much every business transaction happens because of agency. It's the legal framework that lets one person act on behalf of another. Section 182 defends it for us. You have a principal who delegates authority and an agent who acts on that authority. The agent is essentially, and legally, standing in the shoes of the principal. So when an agent signs a contract or buys something, it's just as if the principal did it themselves. Now here's where it gets really interesting. You might think you need a formal written contract for this, but you don't always. Of course, you can create one with a direct appointment, but an agency can also be implied by people's behavior, or it can arise out of pure necessity in an emergency.
You can even create one retroactively through something called ratification, where you approve something someone already did for you without asking first. Now, there is a core principle of agency that's summed up in this Latin phrase, delegatus non potest delegare. It just means a delegate cannot delegate. And it makes perfect sense, right? If a principal hires a specific agent because they trust their skill and judgment, that agent can't just pass the job off to someone else without permission. The trust was personal.
So we've talked a lot about how these contracts protect someone from getting hurt. But let's flip the coin for a second. What about the protectors? The people providing the indemnity or the guarantee? Well, the law doesn't just leave them out in the cold. Let's look at the rights that protect them. Let's start with the cornerstone of protection for the person who is being indemnified. This is all laid out in a crucial part of the law, Section 125 of the Indian Contract Act. Under Section 125, the person being protected has the right to be made completely whole. This means they can recover all the damages they had to pay in a lawsuit, they can recover all the legal costs from defending themselves, and they can even recover money paid in a reasonable settlement. The whole point is to hit a reset button and put them back in the position they were in before the loss ever happened. All right, now what about the guarantor, the person acting as the backup plan? Well, after they've stepped up and paid the debt, Section 140 gives them an exceptionally powerful right. This right is called subrogation, and it is a total game changer. Once the surety pays the debt, they don't just get a simple IOU from the original debtor. No, it's much better than that. They legally step into the shoes of the creditor. This means they inherit all the rights and powers the original creditor had. If the creditor had a mortgage on a house as security, now the surety has that mortgage. It gives them a much, much stronger position to get their money back. And when you boil it all down, this is the central idea here. Indemnity, guarantee, and agency, these aren't just abstract legal ideas. They are practical, indispensable tools. They take a simple promise and turn it into a legally enforceable shield, designed to protect you from financial harm. So, we've looked at the players, the rules, and the rights that create the framework of trust in our financial lives. The final question, then, is for you to think about. Now that you understand how these protections are built, how will you protect your next promise?